Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded room, others with a chance encounter on a busy street. But in the drought-stricken plains of Montana in 1891, one of the most unlikely love stories began with a desperate advertisement and an ocean of misunderstanding. Eleanor Pierce crossed an ocean with nothing but hope and ancient knowledge passed down through generations. Jackson Montgomery had wealth, land, and a legacy crumbling beneath his feet. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the very land beneath their feet. This is the remarkable true story of how Old World wisdom met New World pride, and how a rejected bride became the salvation of the Montgomery fortune. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of the Triple M Ranch as Jackson Montgomery stood on his porch, surveying what remained of his family's legacy. At 32, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw perpetually clenched against the world's disappointments. The ranch had once been the crown jewel of Montana's Paradise Valley. 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land this side of the Mississippi. Now it was dying. 3 years of drought had transformed lush pastures into dusty expanses where nothing thrived. Cattle grew thin, crops withered, and the mighty Montgomery fortune, built by his father and grandfather before him, was draining away like water in sand. Jackson's foreman, Hank Dawson, approached slowly, hat in hand. A man who'd worked the land for 30 years, his weathered face told the story before his words did. "Lost another 12 head last night, Mr. Montgomery. The eastern creek's gone completely dry." Jackson nodded, his expression unchanged, though his stomach twisted. "And the well by the north pasture? Barely a trickle. We've got maybe 2 weeks before it's gone, too." Inside the grand house, Jackson's mother, Vivian Montgomery, sat at the mahogany desk that had once belonged to her husband. At 65, she maintained the regal bearing that had made her the most formidable society hostess in the territory. But today, the ledger open before her contained more red ink than black. "We're nearly out of options, Jackson," she said without preamble when he entered. "The bank won't extend any more credit. The cattle are dying faster than we can sell them, and the Billings property sold for half what we hoped." Jackson poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, though the sun had barely begun its descent. What would father have done? The question wasn't really meant for answering, but Vivian responded anyway. "Your father never faced anything like this. Neither did his father. They had the luck to build this place in years when the sky gave generously." She closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "But there is one option we haven't discussed." When she explained her plan, Jackson's response was immediate and profane. "A mail-order bride. Have you lost your mind, Mother?" Vivian's eyebrow arched dangerously. "Watch your tone, Jackson Henry Montgomery. I raised you better than that." "I'm not some desperate homesteader looking for a woman to warm my bed and cook my meals," he growled. "No, you're the heir to the largest failing ranch in 3 territories," Vivian replied calmly. "The Harrington fortune would save us, Jackson. Charlotte Harrington's father has mining interests from Colorado to California. Their daughter comes with a dowry that would see us through 10 droughts." Jackson stalked to the window. "And all I have to do is sell myself." "All you have to do is marry, which is something men your age typically do regardless. Either that, or watch everything your family built turn to dust." Vivian's tone softened slightly. "Consider it, Jackson, for the ranch, for the 50 families that depend on Triple M, for their livelihood." 3 days later, Jackson sent a telegram to the Harrington family in Boston, expressing his interest in their matchmaking advertisement. The response arrived with surprising speed. The Harringtons were eager to see their youngest daughter settled with a man of property and good name, regardless of his current financial difficulties. Charlotte herself included a brief note expressing her desire to see the West and her willingness to bring substantial resources to the marriage. A photograph showed a petite blonde with a pleasant, if unremarkable, face. The arrangements were made with the efficiency of a business transaction, which Jackson reminded himself bitterly was exactly what this was. Across the Atlantic, in a small village outside Norwich, England, Eleanor Pierce carefully packed the few belongings she would take to America. At 26, she had long ago accepted that marriage had passed her by in a village where most girls wed by 18. The death of her father 6 months earlier had left her with little choice but to accept her cousin's invitation to join her in Boston. What Eleanor didn't expect was her cousin Charlotte's bizarre proposal upon her arrival. "It's quite simple," Charlotte explained over tea in the Harringtons' Back Bay mansion. "I am engaged to marry a wealthy rancher in Montana, but I have absolutely no intention of leaving Boston society to live among cowboys and cattle." Eleanor stared at her cousin in confusion. "But then why agree to the match at all?" Charlotte sighed dramatically. "Because father insists I marry, and all the suitable men in Boston already know about my indiscretions with the Pembroke boy. Father thinks shipping me out west is the only way to salvage the family honor." She leaned forward, eyes gleaming with sudden intensity. "But you, Eleanor, you could go in my place. No one in Montana knows what I look like. We've exchanged exactly 2 letters and a highly flattering photograph. You could be Charlotte Harrington." Eleanor nearly choked on her tea. "That's insane. It's fraud, illegal." "It's an opportunity," Charlotte countered smoothly. "You need a home and security. I need to remain in Boston with certain friends. Father will provide the promised dowry regardless. He'll be so relieved to have me settled that he won't ask questions. The rancher gets his money to save his precious cattle. Everyone benefits." "Except for the man who thinks he's marrying you but gets me instead," Eleanor pointed out. Charlotte waved her hand dismissively. "Jackson Montgomery is getting exactly what he wants, the Harrington fortune. Do you think he cares which Harrington girl comes attached to it? Men like that don't marry for love, Eleanor." Despite her misgivings, Eleanor found herself considering the outlandish proposal. Her prospects in Boston were hardly better than they'd been in England. She had no money, no connections, and few skills valued in polite society. But she did have knowledge, precious wisdom passed down through generations of her family, who had worked the land in Norfolk since before the Norman conquest. The ancient farming methods her father had taught her, preserved in the family's medieval texts, had saved their small holding during hard seasons when their neighbors' fields failed. They were skills that seemed increasingly obsolete in the modern world, but they were hers. "If I agree to this madness," Eleanor said slowly, "I would need to take my books." "Books?" Charlotte looked puzzled. "My father's agricultural texts, family records, farming methods." Charlotte laughed. "Planning to grow turnips in Montana? Bring whatever you want, cousin. I doubt Mr. Montgomery will care about your peculiar hobbies as long as you bring the money." 2 weeks later, Eleanor boarded a westbound train under the name Charlotte Harrington, a bank draft for an astronomical sum secured in her traveling case, and her precious books carefully packed alongside the fine dresses Charlotte had insisted she take. As the train pulled away from the station, Eleanor watched the city disappear and tried to quiet the voice inside that called her a fraud, an imposter, a thief. She consoled herself with the thought that she wasn't stealing anything. Not really. Charlotte didn't want the husband. The husband only wanted the money. And Eleanor? She wanted a place to belong, a purpose, and perhaps, though she scarcely admitted it to herself, a chance to prove that the ancient wisdom in her books still had value in this new, fast-changing world. Little did she know, the that the man waiting in Montana would take one look at her and reject the arrangement entirely, forcing her to make the most desperate gamble of all, with knowledge that hadn't been put to use in centuries. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Clearwater Station was little more than a wooden platform, a telegraph office, and a general store that doubled as the post office. Eleanor stepped down from the train, her legs stiff from 5 days of travel. The late May sun beat down with an intensity she'd never experienced in England, and the air felt stripped of moisture, as if the land itself was desperately thirsty. She wore her best travelling suit, or rather Charlotte's best travelling suit, altered hastily to fit her taller frame. The fine blue wool, perfectly appropriate for Boston society, felt suffocating in the Montana heat. Clutching her small handbag that contained the precious bank draft, Eleanor scanned the small gathering of people on the platform. The man who stepped forward was unmistakable. Jackson Montgomery matched the brief description in the letters. Tall, imposing, with dark hair and a serious expression that seemed carved from the same stone as the distant mountains. His clothes were well made but functional, and despite the financial troubles she knew he faced, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. "Miss Harrington?" His voice was deep with the slightest edge of reservation. Eleanor nodded, fighting the urge to correct him. "Mr. Montgomery, how do you do?" His eyes, grey like a winter sky, assessed her with unconcealed surprise. He'd clearly expected someone else entirely. Someone shorter, blonder, softer, someone who looked like the photograph he'd received. "You're not what I expected," he said bluntly. Eleanor swallowed. "The journey was quite taxing. Perhaps I'm not looking my best." A flash of something, annoyance, suspicion crossed his face. "Let's get your luggage." 2 trunks and her father's locked wooden case were retrieved from the baggage car. Jackson eyed the modest collection with surprise. I was led to believe a Boston society woman would travel with considerably more everything. Eleanor lifted her chin. "I'm practical by nature, Mr. Montgomery. I saw no need to burden your ranch with frivolities." His mouth tightened. "The ranch can handle frivolities just fine, Miss Harrington. It's necessities we're short on, like water and cash." The journey to Triple M Ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. The wagon bounced along rutted roads, passing through terrain unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. The vastness of it stole her breath. Rolling hills stretching to distant mountains, the sky an endless dome above. Beautiful, but visibly suffering. The grass was yellow-brown where it should have been green, streams reduced to trickles, cattle thin and listless in the sparse pastures. "Your land is lovely," she offered, trying to break the silence. Jackson's laugh was short and bitter. "It was lovely. Now it's dying." As they crested a hill, the ranch compound came into view. The main house was impressive, a large 2-story structure of timber and local stone, with wide verandas and tall windows. Several outbuildings, barns, and bunkhouses spread out around it, and beyond them, vast fenced pastures stretched toward the horizon. Despite its grandeur, Eleanor could see signs of the ranch's struggles. Paint peeled from window frames, roof. Shingles were missing in places, and the once manicured gardens had been given over to hardier native plants. A woman stood waiting on the porch, tall, silver-haired, elegant, despite the frontier setting. Vivian Montgomery watched their approach with keen interest, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Welcome to Triple M Ranch, Miss Harrington," she said, as Jackson helped Eleanor down from the wagon. "I trust your journey wasn't too arduous." "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Montgomery," Eleanor replied, falling back on the manners her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "Rosa will show you to your room," Vivian said, gesturing to a middle-aged Mexican woman who had appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served at 6. I'm sure you'll want to rest and refresh yourself after your travels." Eleanor's room was on the second floor, spacious and comfortable, if somewhat faded in its elegance. Large windows faced east toward the distant mountains, and a small balcony offered a view of the ranch compound. Rosa helped her unpack, clucking sympathetically at the wrinkled state of her dresses. "Very pretty," the housekeeper commented, hanging a green silk gown in the wardrobe. "But maybe too fine for ranch. You need sturdy clothes here." "I'll manage," Eleanor said, carefully unpacking her father's books and placing them on the small writing desk. The leather-bound volumes, some dating back centuries, contained the accumulated agricultural wisdom of generations of Pierces. Rosa eyed the books curiously. "You like reading, señorita?" "Very much. These were my father's." Once alone, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, distant cattle lowing, the creak of windmills, men's voices calling to each other across the yard. Everything felt alien, from the dry air to the vastness pressing in from all sides. She unpinned her hair, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders. The woman in the small mirror looked back at her with worried eyes. "What have you gotten yourself into, Eleanor Pierce?" she whispered to her reflection. Dinner was a strained affair. Jackson barely spoke, responding to his mother's attempts at conversation with terse phrases. Vivian carried on valiantly, questioning Eleanor about Boston, her family, her education. Eleanor answered carefully, sticking as closely as possible to the truth, while maintaining the fiction that she was Charlotte Harrington. "And what accomplishments do you bring to Montana, Miss Harrington?" Vivian asked, as the main course was served. "Do you play the piano, paint, sing?" "I'm afraid I have few elegant accomplishments," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm well versed in agriculture. My family has farmed in England for generations." Both Montgomerys stared at her in surprise. "I was given to understand that your father is in mining and railroads," Jackson said, suspicion evident in his tone. Eleanor faltered. "Yes, that's true. But my mother's family were landowners in Norfolk. I spent childhood summers learning about crop rotation, soil enrichment, water management." "How unusual for a society daughter," Vivian remarked, exchanging a look with her son. "Charlotte has many unusual interests," Eleanor said, using her cousin's name deliberately, painfully aware of the deception. Later that evening, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, a sharp knock came at her door. Jackson stood in the hallway, his expression thunderous. "We need to talk," he said, voice low but intense. "In my study, now." The study was a masculine space of dark wood and leather, with mounted animal heads on the walls and maps of the ranch property spread across a large desk. A fire burned in the stone fireplace despite the season, taking the chill from the desert. Night air. Jackson closed the door firmly behind them. "Who are you, really?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "I'm Charlotte Harrington." "No, you're not." He pulled a folded paper from his desk and thrust it at her. "This telegram arrived while you were settling in, from Theodore Harrington himself, informing me that his daughter Charlotte has eloped with her music tutor and fled to Europe. He apologizes for the embarrassment and assures me the agreed-upon dowry will still be transferred as compensation for my inconvenience." He took a step toward her, his height intimidating in the confined space. "So I'll ask you once more, who are you? And why are you pretending to be Charlotte Harrington?" The careful fiction Eleanor had constructed collapsed like a house of cards. Her mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation, but found none. There was nothing left but the truth. "My name is Eleanor Pierce," she said quietly. "I'm Charlotte's cousin from England. After my father died, I came to America hoping for a fresh start. Charlotte convinced me to take her place in this arrangement. She never intended to honor the engagement." Jackson's face darkened with fury. "So this was all a scheme? You were going to marry me under false pretenses?" "The money is real," Eleanor said desperately. "Mr. Harrington still intends to honor that part of the arrangement." Don't give a damn about the money. Jackson's fist came down on the desk with a crack. I agreed to marry a woman, misrepresented to me through a false photograph apparently, not to be the victim of some elaborate society prank. It wasn't meant to be a prank, Eleanor protested. Charlotte didn't want to leave Boston, but her father was insistent. She thought everyone would get what they wanted this way. What I wanted was an honest arrangement with a forthright woman, not a liar and an impostor. The words struck like physical blows. Eleanor squared her shoulders, her own temper flaring. I've been honest about everything except my name. I genuinely came here, prepared to make a life, to be a good wife, to help however I could. Help? Jackson laughed bitterly. What help could you possibly offer this ranch? You're just another burden, another mouth to feed, another drain on resources we don't have. Eleanor felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. I know more about sustainable farming than you might think, Mr. Montgomery. The books I brought. Books won't make it rain, Miss Pierce, he cut her off coldly. Books won't save dying cattle or revive withered crops. He turned away, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, distant. You'll stay the night. Tomorrow, I'll arrange for your return to Clearwater Station. There's a train east the following morning. I suggest you take it. And the dowry? Eleanor asked quietly. Will be returned to Mr. Harrington with my regrets, Jackson said, his back still to her. I won't be bought with tainted money. Eleanor stood frozen, all her hopes crumbling around her. Where am I supposed to go? That, Miss Pierce, is not my concern. You made your choice when you agreed to this deception. As she turned to leave, defeated, Eleanor paused at the door. The land doesn't have to die, Mr. Montgomery. There are ways to survive even the worst droughts. My family's farm in Norfolk thrived when others failed because we used methods others had forgotten. Jackson didn't turn. Good night, Miss Pierce. In the silent darkness of her room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, a plan slowly forming in her desperate mind. If words wouldn't convince him, perhaps actions might. She had one day, one chance, to prove that her knowledge wasn't just theoretical, that the ancient wisdom in her father's books could bring life back to dying land. It would be the most audacious gamble of her life. The eastern sky held only the faintest hint of light as Eleanor made her way across the ranch yard. She had barely slept, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. If she had only one day to prove herself, she would need to make every hour count. The ranch hands were already stirring, cowboys preparing for the day's work, a cook stoking the bunkhouse, fire stable boys tending to horses. They eyed her curiously, but said nothing as she approached an older man who seemed to be giving instructions to the others. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the foreman?" The man turned, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. Hank Dawson?" He touched the brim of his hat. "Can I help you with something?" "I need to see the worst affected areas of the ranch," Eleanor said, "where the drought has hit hardest." Hank exchanged confused glances with a nearby cowboy. "Begging your pardon, Miss Harrington, but Pierce," she corrected. "My name is Eleanor Pierce. And yes, I realize it's an unusual request, but it's important." Something in her tone must have convinced him. "The South Quarter's been hit worst. Nothing growing there for months now. We had to move the cattle out back in March. Can someone take me there? And I'll need basic tools. A shovel, a rake, some empty sacks." Hank hesitated, clearly torn between respecting a guest and questioning her sanity. "Jim can take you," he said finally, nodding toward a young cowboy. "But Mr. Montgomery might not—" "I'll handle Mr. Montgomery," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." The journey to the South Quarter took nearly an hour on horseback. Jim, the young cowboy, didn't speak much. beyond explaining the boundaries of the ranch property as they passed them. Eleanor was grateful for the silence, using the time to gather her thoughts and refresh her memory of what she'd read in her father's books the night before. When they arrived, Eleanor understood immediately why this area had been abandoned. What should have been pastureland was now a dusty expanse of cracked earth and withered vegetation, a dry creek bed cut through the center of the valley, its stones bleached white in the strengthening sun. Eleanor dismounted and walked the perimeter, her eyes scanning the landscape, noting the types of plants that still clung to life in the harsh conditions. She crouched to examine the soil, crumbling it between her fingers. "What are you looking for, miss?" Jim finally asked, curiosity overcoming his reticence. "Signs of life," Eleanor replied, opening her father's book to a carefully marked page. "And water." She showed him a diagram drawn centuries ago by one of her ancestors, a method for finding hidden water sources even in apparently barren landscapes. "In Norfolk, during the Great Drought of 1743, my ancestors saved their lands by rediscovering ancient Roman water harvesting techniques," she explained. "We need to look for specific indicator plants and soil patterns." Jim looked skeptical, but followed as she walked in widening circles, occasionally stopping to dig shallow holes with the shovel he'd brought. After nearly an hour, Eleanor paused before a slight depression dotted with a scruffy plant she recognized from her father's illustrations. "Here," she said decisively. "We'll dig here." As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor directed their efforts, explaining the concept of a qanat, an ancient Persian water management system her ancestors had adapted for English conditions. Jim, initially doubtful, became increasingly engaged as they worked, especially when their digging revealed moisture in the soil less than 4 feet down. "There's an underground seep here," Eleanor explained, brushing dirt from her hands. "Not enough to create a visible stream in these conditions, but enough to support a targeted irrigation system if we can channel it properly." By midday, they had located 3 potential water sources and marked them carefully. Eleanor had moved on to examining the soil composition, explaining to the increasingly interested Jim how the ancient methods in her books focused on water retention and soil health rather than simply adding more water. "The Romans understood that soil is alive," she said, showing him diagrams of layered growing beds. "They built growing systems that maximized every drop of moisture and nurtured the soil itself." "Miss Pierce," the sharp voice cut through their conversation. Eleanor turned to see Jackson Montgomery approaching on horseback, his expression stormy. Behind him rode Hank Dawson, looking apologetic. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jackson demanded as he dismounted. Eleanor straightened, refusing to be intimidated. "Finding water on your dying land, Mr. Montgomery. By digging random holes. This is private property, not a playground for your fancies." "These aren't random holes," Eleanor replied calmly. "They're test sites for underground water seeps that your conventional methods have overlooked." Jackson looked from the holes to Eleanor's dirt-streaked face. "Jim, get back to your regular duties," he ordered. The young cowboy hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. "Actually, sir," Jim said cautiously, "Miss Pierce has found something here. 3 spots with moisture just a few feet down." Jackson frowned, momentarily thrown off balance. "That's not possible. We've surveyed every inch of this section." "You've surveyed it using modern techniques," Eleanor said, holding up her father's book. "These methods are older, much older, and sometimes the old ways see what the new ways. Miss..." Something in her quiet confidence made Jackson pause. He strode to the nearest hole and examined it himself, running his fingers through the damp soil at the bottom with evident surprise. "This doesn't change anything," he said, though with less conviction. "You're still leaving tomorrow. At least let me show you what else I've found," Eleanor persisted. "Give me the rest of today to demonstrate what's possible here." Jackson hesitated, then jerked his head in reluctant assent. "Show me." For the next several hours, Eleanor led Jackson and Hank through her discoveries, explaining the principles behind the ancient farming methods her family had preserved. She showed them techniques for building sunken garden beds that captured morning dew and reduced evaporation, ways to create natural cisterns using the land's contours, and methods for enriching soil with combinations of minerals and organic matter that retained moisture. "The fundamental principle is working with nature rather than against it," she explained, sketching a simple water harvesting system in the dirt. "Modern farming often fights the land's natural patterns. These methods embrace them." As the afternoon sun began its descent, they returned to the ranch compound. Eleanor knew she had piqued their interest, but wasn't sure she had convinced them. Jackson had listened intently, asked probing questions, but remained guarded in his responses. Back at the house, Eleanor washed the dirt from her hands and face, changed her soiled dress, and steeled herself for dinner. She was exhausted but determined to press her case. To her surprise, the dining table was covered with her father's books and papers. Jackson and Vivian were already there, examining a diagram of terraced growing beds. "Miss Pierce," Vivian said. As Eleanor entered, "My son tells me you've spent the day digging in the South Quarter." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor replied cautiously. "I was demonstrating some alternative approaches to water management." "Alternative indeed," Vivian murmured, turning a page in one of the ancient texts. "This system dates to the Roman occupation of Britain. If I'm not mistaken," Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. "You're familiar with ancient agricultural methods, Mrs. Montgomery." "I was a professor of history before I married Montgomery Sr.," Vivian replied with a small smile. "My specialty was ancient civilizations, particularly their technological innovations." "These texts of yours are fascinating," Jackson cleared his throat. "Mother is helping me evaluate the feasibility of your methods, Miss Pierce. While the approach is unorthodox, we can't afford to dismiss any potential solution." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "Does this mean you're considering my proposals?" "It means we're reviewing them," Jackson corrected, his tone still reserved. "The water seeps you found are interesting, but implementing an entire new system would require significant labor and reorganization." "Less than you might think," Eleanor countered, reaching for one of her books, "and the benefits would far outweigh the initial investment." As the three of them discussed possibilities over dinner, Eleanor felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Jackson was still wary, still keeping his emotional distance, but he was listening, truly listening, to her ideas. Vivian was openly enthusiastic, connecting Eleanor's practical knowledge with her own academic understanding of ancient farming systems. As the evening wound down, Jackson finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Why didn't your family use these methods on a larger scale in England? If they're as effective as you claim, you could have built a significant agricultural enterprise." Eleanor sighed. "My father tried. For generations, the Pierce methods were dismissed as old-fashioned superstition by modern farmers. Banks wouldn't lend to expand our holdings. Agricultural societies mocked his presentations. Only the most desperate drought years vindicated him temporarily, and people quickly forgot when the rains returned." She met Jackson's gaze directly. "Sometimes innovation means rediscovering what's been forgotten, Mr. Montgomery. But that requires an open mind, something my father rarely encountered." A moment of understanding passed between them, tense but genuine. "1 week," Jackson said abruptly. "Pardon? You have 1 week to demonstrate these methods on a small test plot. If we see tangible results, we'll discuss further arrangements." Eleanor's heart leapt, but she kept her expression controlled. "Successful land renewal takes more than a week, Mr. Montgomery." "Then you'll need to show me enough promise in a week to justify more time." he replied, his expression unreadable. "That's my offer, Miss Pierce. Take it or leave it." "I'll take it," she said without hesitation. "And I'll need 5 of your men, starting tomorrow." For the first time since her arrival, a hint of a smile touched Jackson's stern features. "You drive a hard bargain for someone in no position to negotiate." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied, with newfound confidence, "I'm in exactly the position I need to be. This land is crying out for help, Mr. Montgomery, and I can hear it. The question is, can you?" As she left the dining room that night, Eleanor caught a glimpse of herself in a hallway mirror. Beneath the fatigue, her eyes shone with purpose. For the first time since her father's death, she felt the rightness of her path. Whether or not she won Jackson's approval, she had found something worth fighting for, and fight she would. The first light of day found Eleanor already deep in her work. True to his word, Jackson had assigned her 5 men, Jim from the previous day, plus 4 others who regarded her with varying degrees of skepticism. But Eleanor had faced doubt before. Her father had taught her that results spoke louder than explanations. "We'll create 3 different test systems," she instructed, sketching in the dirt with a stick. "Traditional irrigation as your control, a Roman-style sunken bed system here, and a Persian Qanat-inspired system connecting the water seeps we found yesterday." The oldest of the ranch hands, a grizzled man called Porter, spat into the dust. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I've been working Montana soil for 30 years. Fancy foreign methods won't make a difference when the sky refuses to open." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. The ancient farmers who developed these techniques lived in regions that received fewer than 10 inches of rain annually, far less than even your worst drought years. They thrived because they understood how to work with what they had rather than lamenting what they lacked. She handed him her father's book, open to a page showing detailed diagrams. "This isn't theory, Mr. Porter. This is tested knowledge that's been forgotten, not disproven." By mid-morning, the team had established the foundation for all 3 test plots. Eleanor worked alongside the men, her sleeves rolled up, demonstrating the precise angles needed for the water catchment systems. The Qanat system required the most labor, a narrow underground channel that would gently guide the underground seep toward the growing area without losing precious moisture to evaporation. Jackson arrived around noon, bringing water and food, all for the workers. He observed silently for several minutes before approaching Eleanor, who was mixing a specific combination of clay, manure, and crushed limestone. "What is that concoction?" he asked, his nose wrinkling at the smell. "Roman soil amendment," Eleanor replied, not pausing in her work. "They called it living earth. It creates a matrix that holds moisture while allowing roots to penetrate easily." "And you learned this from my father's books and practical application?" She glanced up at him. "Each spring, we'd recreate these ancient growing systems on a small scale. My father believed in learning by doing, not just reading." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Jackson's face. "Your father sounds like a practical man, despite his unusual methods." "He was," Eleanor agreed, feeling the familiar pang of loss. He would have loved this ranch, seen the potential beneath the struggle. For a moment, they worked in companionable silence, Jackson helping her spread the mixture across the sunken beds. Eleanor was acutely aware of his proximity, the strength in his hands as they worked the soil together. "Why did you agree to this deception?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "You don't strike me as a dishonest woman by nature." Eleanor paused, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing Charlotte's scandal. "I needed a fresh start. After my father died, the arrangement seemed to offer a purpose, a place to belong, and I believed I could be useful here." "As a farmer, not a wife," Jackson observed. "Perhaps as both," Eleanor said quietly. "But yes, I know the land. It speaks to me in a way people often don't." Something in her words seemed to resonate with him. "I understand that," he admitted. "When everything's going well, owning a ranch is just business. But in times like these, with everything failing despite your best efforts, you realize it's a relationship. The land gives and it takes, and sometimes it tests you beyond endurance." Eleanor nodded. "That's why these methods work. They're built on respect for that relationship, not just extraction." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Eleanor felt a connection that went beyond her farming knowledge or his need for it. But the moment was brief. Jackson straightened, resuming his role as the skeptical ranch owner. "Well, Miss Pierce, your week started today. I'll be watching your progress closely." The following days fell into an exhausting rhythm. Eleanor rose before dawn and worked until dusk, her fair skin reddening despite the wide-brimmed hat she'd borrowed from Rosa. The ranch hands assigned to her project gradually shifted from skepticism to curiosity as the systems took shape. Porter, once the most vocal doubter, became her most dedicated assistant, his decades of practical experience complementing her theoretical knowledge. Together, they refined the Qanat system, identifying additional underground seeps and connecting them to maximize water collection. By the third day, the first tentative signs of success appeared. The soil in the Roman beds remained noticeably moister than the surrounding earth, and tiny seedlings Eleanor had planted using saved seeds from her journey began to emerge in the amended soil. "It's a miracle," Jim murmured, crouching to examine the tender green shoots. "Not a miracle," Eleanor corrected gently, "just knowledge applied correctly. The Romans understood drought conditions better than we give them credit for. Word of the experiment spread through the ranch. Cowboys and house staff found reasons to ride past the South Quarter, observing the unusual growing systems with increasing interest. Even Vivian made the journey, bringing Eleanor a wide-brimmed hat with a proper ribbon and a jar of soothing salve for her sunburned hands. "You're causing quite a stir, Miss Pierce," Vivian commented, as they sat in the shade of a temporary canopy, watching the men construct the final segment of the Qanat system. "Hank tells me some of the other sections are requesting similar trials on their portions of the ranch." Eleanor tried to hide her satisfaction. "The methods can be adapted to different conditions. The eastern pastures would benefit from a different approach than what we're doing here." Vivian studied her thoughtfully. "You truly care about this land, don't you, despite having no claim to it?" "I care about all land," Eleanor replied. "It's a living thing with its own rhythms and needs. When we honor those, it rewards us abundantly. And when we don't," Eleanor gestured to the barren expanse beyond their test plots, "it withdraws, protects itself, waits for wiser stewards." Vivian nodded slowly. "My son could use such wisdom beside him. He's a good man, Eleanor, though his pride makes him difficult at times." "I've noticed both qualities," Eleanor said carefully. "He doesn't speak much about your unusual arrival," Vivian continued, "but I sense his attitude has shifted." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion from the Qanat drew their attention. Water, a small but steady stream, had emerged at the collection point, flowing into the primary irrigation channel. The men were shouting in celebration. Porter's weathered face split by an enormous grin. Eleanor hurried over, her heart pounding with triumph and relief. The Qanat was working, channeling the hidden underground moisture to the surface exactly as the ancient Persian engineers had designed. Thousands of years ago, Jackson arrived just as they were diverting the precious flow into the growing beds. He dismounted quickly, his expression a mix of disbelief and dawning hope as he approached the flowing water. "This is from the underground seeps?" he asked, crouching to touch the cool moisture. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "The Qanat system concentrates what was already here, but inaccessible. We've barely tapped the potential. With more extensive development, we could..." Her explanation was cut short by a shout from the ridge above them. A rider was approaching at a gallop, waving urgently. It was Hank Dawson, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Mr. Montgomery," he called as he reined in. "River's gone bad, full of some kind of red algae. Cattle are sick. Doc Palmer says it's poison." Jackson's momentary elation vanished. "How many cattle affected?" 23 dead already, more ailing. It's spreading downstream fast." Jackson swung back onto his horse. "Porter, keep working here. The rest of you men with me?" He glanced at Eleanor, conflict evident in his expression. "This doesn't change what you've accomplished here, but I need to—" "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said firmly, already moving toward her borrowed horse. "I know something about water contamination." Jackson looked ready to object, then nodded sharply. "Stay close." As they galloped toward the river that served as the ranch's primary water source, Eleanor's mind raced through the sections in her father's books dealing with water purification. If her suspicions were correct, the Triple M was facing a crisis that could dwarf even the drought, but one that ancient wisdom might once again help solve. The week's trial had just become something far more urgent than a demonstration. It had become a fight for the ranch's survival. The stench hit them before they reached the river. The sickly, sweet odor of decay mingled with a sharp, unfamiliar tang that made Eleanor's horse shy nervously. The water itself had transformed, from its usual clear flow to a murky reddish-brown, with patches of foamy scum collecting along the banks. Jackson dismounted quickly, striding toward a bearded man examining a fallen steer. "Doc Palmer, how bad is it?" The veterinarian straightened, with a grim expression. 37 dead now. Whatever this is, it's aggressive. Animals that drank this morning started showing symptoms within hours: disorientation, weakness, then seizures. Eleanor slid from her horse and approached the water cautiously. The distinctive color and smell triggered a memory, a section in one of her father's oldest books, with illustrations of a similar phenomenon. "Mr. Montgomery," she called, "I need to examine the water upstream. This contamination has a specific pattern I recognize." Jackson hesitated only briefly before nodding to one of the cowboys. "Mason, take Miss Pierce up to the North Bend. Stay with her." The ride upstream revealed the problem's source. Around a bend where the river narrowed, a landslide had partially dammed the flow, creating a stagnant pool. There, blooming in the hot sun, was a vast colony of crimson algae. "Blood flower," Eleanor murmured, recalling the ancient term from her father's text. The Romans called it aqua sanguinis, blood water. She dismounted to collect samples in a small glass jar she'd brought from the house. The algae had a distinctive cellular structure she wanted to confirm back at the ranch. "Is it always deadly?" Mason asked, keeping a respectful distance from the contaminated water. "Not always, but it's dangerous in concentrated amounts," Eleanor explained. "It blooms when water stagnates and specific minerals are present. The algae itself isn't the real problem, it's what it does to the water chemistry." When they returned to the main river site, Eleanor found Jackson and Doc Palmer engaged in heated discussion with several senior ranch hands. The situation had worsened. More cattle were showing symptoms, and the contamination was spreading downstream toward neighboring ranches. "We need to drain and divert the river," one man was arguing. "Dig channels to redirect the flow away from grazing areas." "With what manpower?" another countered. "That would take weeks and dozens more men than we have." Eleanor stepped forward, the jar of algae-laden water in her hand. "There's another solution, one that's faster and doesn't require diverting the entire river." All eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from skepticism to desperate hope. "The Romans faced this same contamination in aqueducts and irrigation systems," she explained. They developed a filtration method using layered materials that neutralizes the toxins within days, sometimes hours. Jackson studied her face, searching for certainty. "You're sure about this?" "I've seen the records and illustrations," Eleanor replied. "My father recreated the system once when our pond developed a similar bloom. It worked completely." "What do you need?" His question was simple, but represented a profound shift, from skepticism to trust, from rejection to reliance. "Men, materials, and your permission to implement the system quickly," Eleanor answered. "We'll need to build filter stations at strategic points along the river." Within an hour, the entire ranch was mobilized. Eleanor worked from memory and the few notes she'd made, directing the construction of large filtration beds using alternating layers of sand, charcoal, limestone, and a specific configuration of iron filings that would bind with the toxins. As the men worked, she explained the science as her father had taught her. The Romans discovered this method by accident. They noticed that water flowing through certain mineral formations emerged, clean and safe. They studied and replicated the process, eventually creating systems that kept their aqueducts pure for centuries. Jackson worked alongside her, his sleeves rolled up, sweat streaking the dust on his face. "How long before we know if it's working?" "The first sign should appear within hours," Eleanor said. "The water color will change, becoming clearer as it passes through each filter bed." The afternoon stretched into evening, and still they worked, setting up filtration stations at key points. Along the river, lanterns were lit as darkness fell, casting long shadows across the water's surface. The entire ranch community had come together. Cowboys worked alongside house staff, stable boys carried materials, and even Vivian arrived with food and coffee for the exhausted workers. Near midnight, Eleanor stood at the first filter station, watching intently as water flowed through the carefully constructed layers. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the color began to change. The reddish tint faded, the water emerging from the filter bed clearer, though not yet perfect. "It's working," she breathed, relief washing over her. Jackson appeared at her side, his face haggard with fatigue, but his eyes alert. "The downstream stations are showing the same improvement. Doc Palmer says the unaffected cattle are already drinking from the filtered sections without ill effects." Their eyes met in the lantern light. A moment of shared triumph that needed no words. Eleanor felt something shift between them, a barrier dissolving, replaced by something new and fragile. Dawn found them still at the river, monitoring the filters and adjusting the systems as needed. The transformation was remarkable. The water now ran clear, the deadly red bloom contained and neutralized. Doc Palmer reported no new cattle deaths since midnight, though they had lost nearly 50 animals in total. As the crisis subsided, exhaustion overtook the workers. Jackson ordered most to return to the ranch for rest, leaving only a small crew to maintain the filtration systems. Eleanor found herself walking beside him as they made their way back to the main house, both too tired for pretense or caution. "You saved the ranch today," Jackson said quietly. "Not just the test plots, the entire operation." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I just applied knowledge that was preserved by others. The Romans, my ancestors, they're the ones who deserve the credit. But you're the one who brought that knowledge here, when we needed it most." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "I judged you unfairly when you arrived. I saw only deception, not the value you carried." "We all carry more than what's immediately visible," Eleanor replied. "You've built something remarkable here, despite the challenges. I admire that greatly." They reached the house as the sun crested the eastern hills, bathing the ranch in golden light. Both paused on the porch, reluctant to end the moment despite their exhaustion. "Your week isn't up yet," Jackson said suddenly. "But I think we can." Dispense with the trial period. Your methods have proven themselves beyond any doubt. Eleanor's heart quickened. Does that mean... It means I'd like you to stay, Miss Pierce. Not as Charlotte Harrington or anyone else. As yourself, Eleanor Pierce, with your books and your ancient wisdom, and your stubborn determination to make things grow where they shouldn't. The formal phrasing couldn't disguise the emotion beneath his words. This wasn't merely a business arrangement he was proposing. And in what capacity would I be staying, Mr. Montgomery? Eleanor asked softly, needing clarity despite her fatigue. Jackson's usual confidence faltered. That would depend on you. The ranch needs your knowledge, that's beyond question now. But as for what I need... He trailed off, uncharacteristically unsure. Eleanor took a risk, stepping closer. Perhaps we could determine that together over time, without pretense or false expectations. Relief and something warmer lit his eyes. I'd like that very much, Miss Pierce. Before either could say more, the front door opened. Vivian stood there, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her expression shifting quickly from concern to understanding as she took in the scene before her. The Hands are saying you've worked a miracle at the river, she said to Eleanor. They're calling it the Pierce method already. Eleanor smiled tiredly. Hardly a miracle, just old knowledge finding new purpose. The best kind of knowledge. Vivian agreed. She glanced between them, noting their proximity and the unspoken current between them. You both need rest. We can discuss the future when you've slept. As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, no longer a temporary accommodation, but perhaps the beginning of something permanent, she paused at the window overlooking the ranch. The south quarter was visible in the distance, where her test plots had already begun to transform the barren land into something living. Beyond that, the filtration systems along the river had saved not just cattle, but an entire way of life. Ancient wisdom, once dismissed and forgotten, had found its place in this new world, and perhaps, Eleanor thought, as exhaustion finally claimed her, so had she. The morning air carried a different quality now, still dry, but somehow more alive. Eleanor walked along the edge of what the ranch hands had dubbed Pierce Field, the once barren south quarter now crisscrossed with Roman-style irrigation channels and dotted with emerging vegetation. Young wheat and barley sprouted in carefully constructed beds, while hardier native grasses had been planted as windbreaks between sections. In just 2 weeks, the transformation had been remarkable. Not just here, but across the entire Triple M Ranch. The river filtration systems had been expanded and made permanent, ensuring clean water even if another algae bloom occurred. The Qanat networks now connected underground seeps throughout the property, bringing life-giving moisture to areas that traditional wells had never reached. Thinking about your next miracle. Jackson's voice came from behind her, warm with a note of teasing that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived. Eleanor turned with a smile. Just admiring what everyone has accomplished. Your ranch hands have worked wonders implementing these systems. Our ranch hands, Jackson corrected, coming to stand beside her. They consider you as much a part of Triple M as anyone now. The past 2 weeks had brought changes beyond the physical landscape. Eleanor had found her place within the ranch. Community, not as Charlotte Harrington's replacement or even as Jackson Montgomery's guest, but as herself. The cowboys sought her advice on planting times. Rosa consulted her about expanding the kitchen garden. Even the banker from Clearwater had visited to see the innovative water systems, stammering apologies for his previous skepticism about the ranch's future. I received a letter from Mr. Harrington yesterday, Jackson said, after a comfortable silence. He's withdrawn his daughter from the finishing school in Switzerland, where she fled with her music tutor. Apparently, the young man abandoned her once the money ran out. Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for her cousin despite everything. Charlotte never had much sense about men or money, unlike her cousin. Jackson's gaze was appreciative. Mr. Harrington also formally transferred the dowry funds despite the terminated engagement. He called it compensation for his daughter's disgraceful behavior. Eleanor's eyes widened. But that's a fortune. Surely you told him it wasn't necessary. I did. Jackson smiled slightly. But he insisted. Said his family, honor required it. I've placed it in a separate account, earmarked specifically for expanding the water systems you've designed. That's exceedingly generous of you, Eleanor said, touched by his commitment to her vision. It's practical, Jackson countered. Your methods have already saved the ranch more than that amount in what would have been lost cattle and land. This just ensures we can implement them properly, on a scale that will protect Triple M for generations. They continued walking along the field's edge, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Such casual closeness had developed gradually between them, tentative at first, then increasingly natural as the days passed. The men have been talking, Jackson said after a while, about what to call these methods we're using. Porter suggested Pierce-Montgomery system. Has a certain ring to it, don't you think? Eleanor laughed softly. A bit grandiose for techniques that have existed for thousands of years, but never implemented this way in this place. His hand found hers as they walked, a gesture that felt both significant and inevitable. Some of the ranchers from the valley are riding in tomorrow. They've heard about our success and want to see for themselves. You'll show them? We'll show them, Jackson corrected again. You understand the principles better than anyone. I understand the practical application to ranching. Together we make a convincing case. The word together hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. They reached the eastern boundary of Pierce Field, where a small structure was being built, a combination tool shed and observation station where weather patterns could be recorded and water flows monitored. I've been thinking, Jackson said, his tone shifting to something more careful, about our conversation on the porch after the river crisis. About you staying at Triple M and what that might mean. Eleanor's heart quickened. Yes, these past weeks have made it clear that the ranch needs you, your knowledge, your vision. But I've realized something even more important. He turned to face her fully. I need you, Eleanor. Not for the ranch or the water systems or the ancient farming methods, though all of those are remarkable. I need you because when you're near, everything makes more sense. The struggles seem surmountable. The future looks bright in a way it hasn't for years. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. Jackson, I know it's sudden, he continued. Quickly, we've known each other only a short time, and under unusual circumstances. I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be presumptuous, given our brief acquaintance. But I am proposing a partnership in every sense of the word. Running the ranch together, developing these systems together, and perhaps in time, building a life together. The directness of his words, so characteristic of the man himself, touched Eleanor deeply. Here was no flowery courtship, no practiced lines, just honest feeling expressed plainly. I would like that very much, she replied, matching his honesty with her own. I found something here I never expected, not just purpose, but belonging. With the land, with the community, and most surprisingly with you. His smile was like sunrise breaking across the mountains. Then it settled. Partners in all things, with time to discover what that fully means. Their moment was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching horses. A group of riders was coming from the main house, Vivian at the lead, accompanied by several ranch hands Eleanor recognized from the river crisis. As they approached, Eleanor saw that Vivian carried something large wrapped in cloth. The older woman dismounted with surprising grace, her face alight with excitement. "Eleanor, dear, you won't believe what I've found," she called. "I had Mason ride into Clearwater to send telegrams to some of my old academic colleagues. One of them directed me to a private collection in Helena that contained this. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal an ancient leather-bound volume with tarnished metal clasps. The cover bore faded Latin text and elaborate scrollwork. It's a complete copy of Columella's De Re Rustica, his treatise on Roman agriculture, Vivian explained, including sections on drought management that were thought lost to history. The university only had fragments, but this copy is intact. Eleanor gasped, handling the precious volume with reverent care. This contains techniques we haven't even begun to implement. Aqueduct designs, seasonal planting calendars calibrated to drought conditions, soil amendment formulas. Jackson watched her excitement with evident pleasure. It seems the Montgomery Pierce Agricultural Library will need its own building soon. Actually, Vivian said with a knowing smile, I've already begun clearing space in the East Wing. The room with the best light, naturally. I've ordered additional bookshelves from the carpenter in Clearwater. Eleanor looked between mother and son, overwhelmed by the acceptance and support they offered. I don't know what to say. This is beyond anything I could have hoped for when I arrived. Say you'll help us build something unprecedented, Jackson suggested. A place where old wisdom and new challenges meet, where ancient techniques find modern application, and where a reluctant rancher and an unexpected bride discovered common ground, Vivian added with a twinkle in her eye. Eleanor's laugh was bright with joy and possibility. When you put it that way, how could I possibly refuse? As they rode back toward the main house, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her here. Charlotte's deception, her own desperate gamble, Jackson's initial rejection, all steps that seemed like setbacks at the time, but had ultimately brought her exactly where she needed to be. The Triple M Ranch spread before them, no longer struggling against the drought, but working in harmony with the land's natural patterns. Fields that had been barren now showed the first promising signs of life. Cattle grazed contentedly along the purified river. Ranch hands waved as they passed, calling greetings to Miss Pierce with genuine respect. And beside her rode Jackson. Montgomery, no longer the stern, reserved man who had met her at the station, but a partner in the truest sense, one who had learned to see beyond his preconceptions to the possibilities that lay beneath. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Eleanor smiled, watching the sun glint off the distant mountains. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most valuable knowledge isn't found in books at all. It's discovered in the most unexpected places if we're brave enough to look." Jackson's hand found hers again, their fingers intertwining naturally. "And if we're fortunate enough to recognize it when we find it." Ahead, the ranch house stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky, not just a structure anymore, but the beginning of a shared future, built on ancient wisdom and new hope. The summer sun beat down on a gathering unlike any previously seen at Triple M Ranch. 24 ranchers from across the territory had arrived on horseback and in wagons, drawn by rumors of the miracle in Montana, a ranch that had not merely survived the devastating drought, but was beginning to thrive. Eleanor stood beside Jackson as they led the tour through Pierce Field, now a vibrant tapestry of green amid the parched landscape. The contrast was stark and compelling. On one side of the boundary markers lay the traditional ranching methods with their struggling results. On the other, the integrated Roman-Persian system with its flourishing crops and efficient water usage. "The key principle," Eleanor explained to the assembled men, "isn't adding more water, but maximizing what's already available. These channels follow the land's natural contours, using gravity to distribute moisture precisely where it's needed." She demonstrated how the sunken beds retained morning dew and prevented evaporation, while the layered soil amendments created an environment where plants required significantly less water to thrive. Questions came rapidly, some skeptical, others curious. Eleanor answered each patiently, rooting her explanations in practical application rather than theory. These were working men, not scholars. They needed to understand how the methods would function on their own lands, with their own specific challenges. "And the initial investment?" asked a gruff rancher from the next valley, his weathered face creased with doubt. "How long before these fancy methods pay for themselves?" "Our calculations show complete return within 2 growing seasons," Jackson replied. "The first Qanat systems have already increased water availability by 60%, saving us the cost of purchased feed for the cattle. By next spring, we expect to be entirely self-sufficient in grain production." The numbers were compelling, especially to men facing financial ruin from the prolonged drought. As they moved to the next demonstration area, a section showcasing the river filtration system, Eleanor noticed a latecomer joining the group. Unlike the other ranchers in their practical workwear, this man wore an expensive suit and derby hat, his clean hands marking him as someone unaccustomed to physical labor. Jackson noticed him too, his expression cooling noticeably. "Caldwell," he acknowledged with a nod that stopped just short of rudeness. "Montgomery." The man removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and sharp, assessing eyes. "Quite a spectacle you've created here, almost theatrical in its presentation." The undercurrent of dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Pierce Field produces real crops and supports real cattle, Caldwell. There's nothing theatrical about results." Eleanor looked between the men, sensing a history she wasn't privy to. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Eleanor Pierce. Bradford Caldwell, Miss Pierce." He offered a small bow. "Montana Territorial Banking Association. I hold interests in several regional banks, including Clearwater Savings and Loan." Understanding dawned. This was the man who had denied Jackson additional credit, who had predicted the failure of Triple M Ranch, and perhaps even positioned himself to acquire the land when the Montgomery family could no longer maintain it. "Mr. Caldwell has always taken a keen interest in the financial difficulties of his neighbors," Jackson added, a sharp edge to his words. "Merely prudent business practice," Caldwell replied smoothly. "Though I must admit, this transformation is unexpected. Your mother indicated you were pursuing some sort of innovative solution, but I had envisioned something more conventional. Improved well drilling, perhaps, or breeding more drought-resistant cattle. The ancient methods Miss Pierce has implemented go beyond conventional thinking," Jackson said. "As you can see, they're producing unconventional results." Caldwell surveyed the green fields with a calculating eye. "Indeed. And now you're sharing these secrets with your fellow ranchers? Rather generous, considering their potential value." "Knowledge meant to help the land shouldn't be hoarded," Eleanor said firmly. "These methods were developed to benefit communities, not individuals." "A charming sentiment." Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "However, I wonder if you've considered the broader implications. The Banking Association has significant investments in modern agricultural equipment, irrigation companies, and traditional feed suppliers. If ranchers adopt these primitive methods, many of those investments become substantially less valuable." The threat beneath his polite words was clear. Jackson stepped slightly closer to Eleanor, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on Caldwell. "The drought affects everyone, Mr. Caldwell," Jackson said. "Surely even bankers benefit when ranches remain solvent and loans are repaid. In the short term, perhaps." Caldwell replaced his hat precisely. "In the longer view, progress requires consolidation. The future of ranching lies in larger operations, modern equipment, and centralized control of resources, not in reviving techniques from ancient Rome." He turned to address the gathered ranchers. "Gentlemen, while these methods appear promising, on this small scale, I would caution against hasty implementation. The Banking Association will need to carefully evaluate loan applications for such experimental approaches. A murmur ran through the group. For struggling ranchers, access to capital was essential, even for improvements that might ultimately save their lands. If the banks refuse to finance these systems, "You're threatening them," Eleanor said, unable to remain silent. "Using your financial power to discourage innovation that might disrupt your preferred vision of agriculture." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "I'm merely stating financial reality, Miss Pierce. Banks have a responsibility to investors. Unproven methods represent unacceptable risk." "Unproven?" Eleanor gestured to the flourishing fields around them. "What do you call this? A curiosity, perhaps even a temporary success." His tone was dismissive, but one unusual season on one ranch hardly constitutes verification. Scientific validation requires rigorous testing, comparative studies, years of data. A new voice entered the conversation. Vivian Montgomery, approaching from the direction of the house. "How fortunate, then, that we've arranged exactly that." She handed Eleanor a telegram, her eyes bright with triumph. "It arrived this morning, while you were preparing for the tour. The Agricultural Department at the Montana Territorial College has accepted our proposal. They're sending a team of scientists next week to begin a formal study of the Triple M systems." Eleanor scanned the telegram, her heart lifting at the formal academic language confirming the arrangement. "They're committing to a 2-year assessment with quarterly published reports. A government-endorsed study would carry significant weight," one of the ranchers noted, hope evident in his voice. Caldwell's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "Government bureaucrats are notoriously susceptible to unusual theories. I doubt their assessment will sway practical financial considerations." "Perhaps," Vivian agreed pleasantly, "but I've also been in communication with the National Farming Journal. They've expressed interest in publishing an illustrated article on our methods next month, reaching thousands of farmers and ranchers across the country." This was news to Eleanor and Jackson as well, judging by their surprised expressions. Vivian continued, her society manners now serving a different purpose than mere politeness. "And most interestingly, Mr. Caldwell, I've received an inquiry from your competitors at Western Union Banking. They seem quite interested in financing innovative drought management systems, particularly for smaller family ranches that might otherwise face foreclosure." Caldwell's complexion reddened slightly. "Vivian, you've always had a flair for the dramatic. Banking decisions aren't made based on a single successful experiment." "Of course not," she agreed. "They're made based on profit potential. And right now, Mr. Caldwell, the profit lies in helping ranches survive, not acquiring their foreclosed lands at discount prices." The assembled ranchers watched this exchange with growing interest and a new sense of possibility. If alternative financing existed and government validation was forthcoming, Caldwell's implied threats carried far less weight. Recognizing his position had weakened, Caldwell adjusted his strategy. "The Banking Association is always open to proven innovations. Perhaps once the college study is complete, we might reconsider our position on financing these traditional methods." "How progressive of you," Vivian remarked dryly. Caldwell tipped his hat to the group. "I've taken enough of your time. Do continue the tour. It's most educational." With that, he strode toward his waiting carriage, back straight but purpose decidedly thwarted. As the tour resumed, the ranchers' questions took on a new enthusiasm. The potential obstacle of financing had been addressed at least partially, and the promise of official validation added legitimacy to methods that might otherwise have seemed too unconventional. Later, as the visitors departed with notebooks full of observations and sketches, Eleanor found a moment alone with Vivian. "On the main house porch, I had no idea you were corresponding with the college and banking competitors," she said admiringly. "That was brilliant tactical thinking." Vivian smiled, a hint of the formidable society hostess visible beneath her now practical ranch attire. My dear, I managed the social battlefield of Boston for 30 years before coming west. Banking politics are straightforward by comparison. Her expression grew more serious. Caldwell has had designs on Triple M for years. He's not a man who accepts defeat easily. You think he'll create more problems? I think progress always faces resistance, especially when it threatens existing power structures. Vivian patted Eleanor's hand. But we have resources he doesn't expect. Ancient wisdom, scientific curiosity, and the power of demonstrated success. As the last wagon disappeared down the long drive, Jackson joined them, his expression thoughtful. Caldwell will try to undermine the college study. He has connections there. Then we'll ensure the results are too compelling to dismiss, Eleanor said with determination. The land doesn't lie, Jackson. When something works, the results speak for themselves. He took her hand, his touch conveying gratitude and partnership. We have 1 month before the college team arrives. Let's make sure what they find exceeds even our own expectations. The challenge ahead was clear, not just to continue developing the Triple M systems, but to document and validate them in ways that would convince even the most skeptical observers. Yet as Eleanor looked out over the transformed landscape, she felt not fear, but anticipation. The ancient wisdom in her father's books had found its purpose here, bridging centuries to address modern challenges. Now it needed only to be proven to a world that had forgotten its value. We'll be ready, she promised, her voice soft but certain. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large east-facing windows of what had once been Vivian's parlor, but was now the Triple M Agricultural Library. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with Eleanor's father's texts, the precious Columella volume, and dozens of newer acquisitions Vivian had sourced from universities and private collections across the country. In the center of the room, a large table held maps, diagrams, and careful records of every aspect of the ancient farming systems they'd implemented. Eleanor and Jackson worked side by side, organizing the material for the college research team scheduled to arrive in less than a week. The water flow measurements from the North Kanat network show a 15% increase since we extended the channels, Eleanor noted, adding the figures to her meticulous documentation. That's significant enough to include in the primary demonstration. Jackson nodded, studying a map of soil composition across the ranch. The amended sections are showing marked improvement in moisture retention. Porter took samples from 20 different locations yesterday. The difference between treated and untreated areas is visible even to the untrained eye. Their work was interrupted by Rosa, who appeared in the doorway with an unusual expression, somewhere between concern and curiosity. Miss Eleanor, Mr. Jackson, there are visitors. A lady and gentleman from Boston, they say. Eleanor and Jackson exchanged puzzled glances. They weren't expecting Eastern visitors, particularly not from Boston. Did they give their names? Jackson asked, already rising from his chair. Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Harrington, Rosa replied. Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. Theodore Harrington, Charlotte's father, the man whose dowry had helped finance the ranch's transformation, the man she had inadvertently deceived. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. They're here, now. Her voice sounded distant, to her own ears. Jackson moved to her side, his hand steadying on her arm. It was inevitable they would learn the truth eventually, he said quietly. Better to face it directly than hide. Heart pounding, Eleanor nodded. Whatever consequences came from this unexpected visit, she would meet them with honesty. The deception had never been her idea, but she had participated in it, however reluctantly. They found the Harringtons in the main sitting room, where Vivian was already entertaining them with practiced social grace. Theodore Harrington was a solid, imposing man with a square jaw and calculating eyes that immediately reminded Eleanor of Charlotte. Beside him sat a slender woman with a nervous manner, her gloved hands clutching an ornate handbag. "Ah, here they are," Vivian said, as Eleanor and Jackson entered. "Allow me to introduce my son, Jackson Montgomery, and Miss Eleanor Pierce." Theodore Harrington rose, his expression unreadable. "Miss Pierce, we've been most eager to make your acquaintance." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable as Eleanor struggled to find appropriate words. Finally, she stepped forward, chin lifted. "Mr. Harrington, I owe you an explanation and an apology. The deception regarding Charlotte was—" "No need, Miss Pierce," he interrupted, his tone surprisingly mild. "My daughter's creative solution to her predicament has been thoroughly explained to us. Charlotte has always possessed more cunning than wisdom." Mrs. Harrington spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "We've come to Montana not to demand explanations, but to see for ourselves what our investment has helped create. News of your agricultural innovations has reached even Boston." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You've heard of our methods?" "The National Farming Journal published a preliminary article last week," Theodore explained. "When I saw the Montgomery Ranch mentioned, along with references to ancient Roman techniques, I became curious. A ranch I had financially supported was suddenly being hailed as revolutionary in drought management. And the name Eleanor Pierce was prominently featured," Mrs. Harrington added, "a name we recognized from family correspondence as Charlotte's English cousin." Jackson gestured. "For everyone to sit. You're not here to demand the return of the dowry." Theodore's laugh was short but genuine. "Mr. Montgomery, I am first and foremost a businessman. The dowry was intended as an investment in my daughter's future security. If that investment is instead producing remarkable agricultural innovations that could benefit properties throughout my portfolio, why would I withdraw it?" Eleanor felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by cautious optimism. "Then you're not angry about the deception?" "Charlotte's behavior has long since exhausted my capacity for anger," Theodore replied dryly. "Though I am curious how a young English woman came to possess such specialized knowledge of ancient farming methods." As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor shared the story of her father's lifelong dedication to preserving traditional agricultural wisdom, and how his carefully maintained texts had passed to her upon his death. The Harringtons listened with evident fascination, particularly when she explained how the ancient techniques had been adapted to address Montana's specific challenges. "The Romans faced similar conditions in North Africa and parts of Spain," Eleanor explained. "Their solutions were ingenious, working with natural water movement rather than against it, understanding soil composition at a level we're only now rediscovering with modern science." Theodore nodded thoughtfully. "Harrington Industries has significant holdings in the southwestern territories. Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, all face water scarcity similar to what you're addressing here. The principles could certainly be adapted to those environments," Eleanor said. "In fact, some of the Persian techniques in my father's books were specifically developed for desert conditions." A calculating look entered Theodore's eyes. Not unlike the expression Eleanor had seen when Charlotte was formulating one of her schemes, but tempered with a businessman's practical assessment. "Mrs. Montgomery mentioned that a scientific delegation is arriving soon to assess your methods," he said. "Their validation would be valuable for wider implementation." "The Montana Territorial College team arrives next week," Jackson confirmed. "Their study will be thorough. Soil composition, water management, crop yields, livestock impact." Theodore exchanged a glance with his wife before continuing. "I have connections with the agricultural department at Harvard. A second, parallel study from an established Eastern institution would add considerable weight to your findings. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. You would arrange that? It would serve multiple purposes, Theodore replied pragmatically. Scientific validation of methods that could benefit my Western holdings, positive publicity for Harrington Industries as a patron of agricultural innovation, and— He paused, a hint of genuine emotion breaking through his businesslike demeanor. A better outcome to this unusual situation than I could have hoped for, given Charlotte's impulsive actions. Later that evening, after the Harringtons had been shown to guest rooms for their 3-day visit, Eleanor sat with Jackson and Vivian on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the distant mountains. "Well," Vivian said with dry amusement, "this day certainly took an unexpected turn. I never imagined Theodore Harrington as an ally in our agricultural revolution." "He's a pragmatist," Jackson observed. "He recognizes value and opportunity, regardless of how unconventionally they appear." Eleanor shook her head in wonder. "When I think of how terrified I was to face him, to admit my part in Charlotte's deception, and now he's offering to bring Harvard researchers to study our methods." "Life seldom follows the paths we expect," Vivian said softly. "Sometimes its detours lead us to precisely where we need to be." The next morning brought another surprise. As Eleanor showed Mrs. Harrington the kitchen gardens, where Rosa was implementing modified versions of the Roman growing techniques for vegetables and herbs, the older woman broached an unexpected subject. "My husband is impressed with you, miss." "Yes," she said, examining a thriving tomato plant. "Not just your agricultural knowledge, but your character. You've made something meaningful from a situation that began with deception." "I've tried to act honorably," Eleanor replied carefully. Mrs. Harrington's smile was tinged with sadness. "Charlotte has always taken the easier path. When faced with her father's expectations for the marriage arrangement, she saw only constraint, not opportunity." She touched a ripening tomato gently. "You saw the possibilities beyond the initial circumstances." "I was desperate for a fresh start," Eleanor admitted. "My father's death left me with knowledge, but no place to apply it. The Montgomery Ranch needed exactly what I could provide, even if Jackson didn't realize it initially." "And now, Mrs. Harrington's question was pointed, but kind. Eleanor felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Now we're partners in the truest sense. We're building something together, not just agricultural systems, but a shared vision for the future." Mrs. Harrington nodded approvingly. "Theodore and I began similarly. Behind his business empire lies a partnership formed when we were both young and uncertain. He had ambition. I had the social connections his merchant family lacked. Together, we built something neither could have achieved alone." Later that day, Eleanor found Jackson near the river, inspecting the expanded filtration system. The Harringtons had gone riding with Vivian to view the outer ranch boundaries, giving them a rare moment alone. "Your mother believes the Harringtons' support will completely neutralize Caldwell's opposition," Eleanor said, joining him on the riverbank. Jackson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Theodore Harrington's influence extends well beyond Caldwell's Territorial Banking Association. If Harvard researchers validate our methods alongside the Montana College team, even the most skeptical investors will take notice. It's strange to think that Charlotte's deception ultimately led to this unexpected alliance," Eleanor mused. "When I agreed to take her place, I never imagined it would lead to agricultural innovation, scientific validation, or—" She hesitated, suddenly shy despite everything they'd shared. Jackson turned to her, his eyes warm with understanding. "Or us." "Yes," she said simply. He took her hand, his touch familiar now but still thrilling. "I've been thinking about what you said when you first arrived, that you came prepared to be a good wife, to help however you could." Eleanor remembered the painful confrontation in his study when her deception had been revealed and rejection had seemed certain. That was true, even if my identity wasn't. I know that now. His voice was gentle but certain. I've seen your commitment to this land, to its people, to building something meaningful here. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The partnership. We've discussed running the ranch together, developing these systems. It's been everything I could have hoped for. But I find myself wanting more. Eleanor's heart quickened. What are you saying, Jackson? I'm saying that I no longer need time to discover what our partnership fully means. His eyes held hers steadily. I know what I want, Eleanor, not Charlotte, Harrington or her dowry, or any arrangement of convenience. I want you, your wisdom, your determination, your heart, as my wife and my true partner in all things. The simplicity and honesty of his words touched her deeply. This was not the practiced proposal of a society suitor or the calculated arrangement that had originally brought her to Montana. This was something real, forged through shared purpose, mutual respect, and genuine feeling. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Montgomery. Their kiss was witnessed only by the flowing river and the wide Montana sky, a private moment of connection that sealed a partnership already proven through challenges met and obstacles overcome together. As they walked back toward the ranch, house hand in hand, Eleanor thought of her father and his lifelong dedication to preserving ancient wisdom. How surprised and pleased he would be to know that his precious books had found their purpose in this distant land, that his daughter had found not just a use for her unconventional knowledge, but a true home for her heart. Tomorrow would bring the Harvard researchers, followed by the Montana College team. There would be demonstrations and explanations, scientific validation and practical applications. The work of transforming Triple M Ranch, and perhaps ranching throughout the drought-stricken territories, was only beginning. But tonight, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, Eleanor, Pierce knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. Snow dusted the distant mountains, but the valley floor remained clear, the December sun casting long shadows across Triple M Ranch. What had once been struggling pastures now hosted a complex tapestry of cultivation and research. The South Quarter, still called Pierce Field, though now officially Montgomery Pierce Agricultural Research Station, hummed with activity despite the season. Eleanor stood on the porch of the expanded main house, watching as a group of researchers collected soil samples from test plots where winter crops were thriving despite the cold. The distinctive blue jackets of the Montana Territorial College team worked alongside the crimson scarves of the Harvard researchers. Their previous academic rivalries dissolved in the face of compelling results. The wheat yield calculations are complete, Vivian said, joining Eleanor with a thick folder of documentation. Triple the regional average, with 40% less water usage. Even Harvard's conservative team admits it's unprecedented. And the water quality measurements? Eleanor asked, accepting the folder. Exceeding all standards. The expanded river filtration system has been approved as a model for implementation throughout the territory. Vivian's voice contained well-deserved pride. Governor Richardson is arriving next week to see it personally. 6 months had brought extraordinary changes to Triple M Ranch. The initial scientific assessments had been so promising that both research teams had extended their studies, establishing permanent observation stations across the property. Theodore Harrington, recognizing the potential beyond even his original expectations, had provided additional funding for dedicated research buildings and equipment. "There you are," Jackson called, emerging from the new barn with Porter at his side. "The irrigation channel modifications for the east section are complete. The engineers say we can expand to the North Ridge by spring." As he approached, Eleanor, noted the easy confidence in his stride, so different from the tense, burdened man who had met her at the train station. Success had softened his edges without diminishing his strength, transforming determination into vision. "Bradford Caldwell's representative is waiting in the study," Porter added, his weathered face creased with amusement. "Third visit this month. Never thought I'd see the Banking Association begging to finance experimental farming." Eleanor and Jackson exchanged knowing smiles. Caldwell's opposition had transformed to enthusiastic support once the scientific validation proved irrefutable, and neighboring ranches began implementing similar systems with remarkable results. The banker now prominently advertised special financing for Montgomery Pierce agricultural methods, claiming credit for supporting innovative approaches he had once dismissed as primitive. "I'll handle Caldwell's man," Jackson said. "You have. More important visitors arriving soon." Eleanor nodded, anticipation quickening her pulse. The train should be here by now. Rosa's prepared the guest rooms, and the documentation is ready for review. The sound of approaching wagons drew their attention. Coming up the long drive was not one vehicle, but a caravan. 3 wagons laden with trunks and equipment, followed by riders on horseback. At the lead was a sight that brought a wide smile to Eleanor's face, a distinguished older gentleman with a scholarly bearing beside a team of younger assistants carefully managing crates of books and instruments. Professor Whitman and the Cambridge team, Eleanor said with quiet excitement, all the way from England. The arrival of British agricultural historians had been Theodore Harrington's latest contribution to the growing research enterprise. Upon learning that Eleanor's methods originated from ancient texts preserved by her family, he had arranged for leading scholars from Cambridge University to examine the original sources and context of the techniques now transforming Western agriculture. "Did you ever imagine your father's books would draw such attention?" Jackson asked, taking her hand as they watched the approaching procession. Eleanor shook her head, emotion tightening her throat. He faced such skepticism in England. People called his methods outdated, impractical. "If only he could see this." "I think perhaps he does," Jackson said softly, his usual practicality giving way to a rare moment of sentiment. As Professor Whitman's wagon reached the main house, Eleanor moved forward to greet him, professional composure masking her deeper feelings. This scholarly validation of her father's lifelong work represented a personal vindication she had never dared hope for. "Mrs. Montgomery," the professor called, descending from the wagon with surprising agility for his age. "An honor to meet you at last. Your father's preservation of these agricultural techniques represents a contribution to historical knowledge that simply cannot be overstated." "The honor is mine, Professor," Eleanor replied warmly. "Your interest in these methods means more than you know." As the Cambridge team was shown to their quarters and the precious crates of research materials were carefully unloaded, Eleanor found herself drawn to the eastern edge of the property. There, on a gentle rise overlooking Pierce Field, stood a simple structure that held special significance. The small building housed the core of her father's library, expanded now with contributions from universities and private collections worldwide. Built of local stone and timber, with large windows to capture the Montana light, it stood as a bridge between past and future, ancient wisdom preserved for modern application. Inside, the scent of leather bindings and parchment created an atmosphere of reverence. Eleanor moved among the shelves, fingers brushing spines of texts that had traveled across oceans and centuries to find their purpose here. Her father's careful handwriting filled the margins of many volumes, his insights connecting Roman engineers to Persian watermasters to English agricultural innovations. "I thought I might find you here," Jackson said, entering quietly. "You always retreat to the library when you're processing big emotions." Eleanor smiled, acknowledging the truth in his observation. 4 months of marriage had taught them each other's patterns and needs. It still feels surreal sometimes, all of this from a desperate gamble when I had nowhere else to go. Jackson joined her at the central table, where maps of the expanding implementation sites across the territory were spread beside diagrams of newly refined irrigation systems. Not a gamble, he corrected gently. A recognition of value where others saw only obstacles. You understood what this land needed when even those of us who'd worked it for generations were blind to the possibilities. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Rosa appeared slightly breathless with excitement. "Mr. Jackson, Miss Eleanor, more visitors." A telegram came first, but they arrived right behind it. Following Rosa back to the main house, they found Vivian in animated conversation with two unexpected guests, a slender young woman with familiar features and a serious-looking gentleman in academic attire. "Charlotte," Eleanor whispered, recognizing her cousin despite the changes in her appearance. Gone were the elaborate gowns and fashionable hairstyle, replaced by sensible traveling clothes and a simpler bearing. "Eleanor," Charlotte replied, a complex mix of emotions flashing across her face. "Or should I say, Mrs. Montgomery?" For a moment, the past hung between them. The deception, the switched identities, the divergent paths their lives had taken. Then Charlotte stepped forward, offering her hand with uncharacteristic humility. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "What began as my selfish scheme somehow transformed into all this." She gestured to encompass the visible success surrounding them. "Allow me to introduce my husband, Professor James Harlow," Charlotte continued. "Father has finally reconciled himself to our marriage, particularly since James has been appointed to the Harvard Agricultural Research Team." The young professor nodded respectfully. "Your work here has revolutionized our understanding of historical agricultural methods, Mrs. Montgomery. The university specifically requested I join the Montana Research Initiative." As they moved to the parlor for refreshments, Eleanor observed her cousin with new perspective. Charlotte seemed genuinely changed, less frivolous, more purposeful. Perhaps facing consequences had provided its own valuable lessons. That evening, an impromptu gathering filled the main house. Research teams from Montana, Harvard, and Cambridge mingled with ranch workers and neighboring farmers who had implemented Eleanor's methods. Theodore Harrington engaged Professor Whitman in animated discussion of potential applications in Arizona territories, while Vivian charmed the governor's advance representatives with her combination of society manners and practical knowledge. Jackson found Eleanor by the window, watching the unlikely assembly with quiet satisfaction. "Your father would be proud," he said, echoing his earlier sentiment, "not just of the agricultural success, but of how you've brought these different worlds together." Eleanor leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When I arrived here, I thought I was just seeking a place to belong. I never imagined creating a place where so many different kinds of knowledge could find common purpose. That's the true miracle of Triple M Ranch," Jackson mused. "Not just the crops or the water systems, but the community of understanding you've helped build." Outside, beneath a sky bright with stars, the ranch stretched in all directions, fields resting until spring, irrigation channels carrying precious water even in winter, research stations documenting every aspect of their ongoing work. What had begun as one family's struggle against drought had evolved into a model that could transform agriculture throughout the arid West. "We should rejoin our guests," Eleanor said, though she was reluctant to leave this moment of quiet reflection. Jackson nodded, but kept her hand in his. "First, I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped package. "I had this made in Clearwater last week." Inside the wrapping, Eleanor found a beautifully crafted brass plate, sized to fit the entrance to the library. The inscription read, "The Pierce Montgomery Agricultural Research Library, where ancient wisdom meets future innovation. "It's perfect," she whispered, emotion making her voice unsteady. "A fitting legacy for the girl who traveled across an ocean with nothing but books and determination," Jackson said, his own voice warm with pride and love. And for the reluctant rancher who eventually recognized the treasure that had arrived on his doorstep. As they returned to their guests, Eleanor reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her here. From desperate deception to genuine partnership, from rejection to respect, from isolated knowledge to shared innovation. Each step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to create this unexpected legacy. The ancient Romans had understood that water finds its path regardless of obstacles. Eleanor Pierce Montgomery had discovered the same truth about knowledge, about purpose, and ultimately, about love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.